We'll be going over the YH-5000SE, Yamaha's recently released $5,000 flagship open-back headphone. It features what Yamaha calls an orthodynamic driver. What's an orthodynamic driver, you ask? Well, it's simply an older term that we now call planar drivers, but Yamaha sticks with its historical terminology. The orthodynamic driver, or planar driver, in the 5000 SE was constructed with some high-end craftsmanship. To quote Yamaha, these upgrades include eliminating the fixed central structure of conventional headphone drivers, ensuring shape retention by use of concentric circle corrugation and pattern reinforcement, and avoiding magnetic substances in the vicinity. The result, according to Yamaha, is heightened driver sensitivity. There's even more fun to be had in the housing itself. The deep, cavernous cans provide natural acoustic volume, even with their open-back design, and a Dutch weave stainless steel filter controls internal pressure and features an arch-shaped protrusion that serves as a reflector. Now, let's see what you get with the YH-5000SE. You get your 5000 SE headphones, a 2-meter braided cable with a 4.4mm balance jack, a 2-meter cable with an unbalanced 3.5mm jack and 6.35mm adapter, 2 pairs of ear pads, leather and sheepskin combo, as well as ultra suede, and a sturdy metal headphone stand. Simple assembly required. Now, before jumping into this review, let me just put all my cards on the table and say straight up that this is a new all-time favorite for me. I would say that the YH-5000SE qualifies as being my all-time favorite open-back headphone. If you asked me a week ago, I probably would have told you the Dan Clark Expanse. This week, though, and for the foreseeable future, it is the YH-5000SE. Now, that being said, we can move on to the rest of the review, and I'll explain why I love this headphone so much. So it's a very lightweight headphone, comes in at 325 grams, which is lightweight for a headphone in general, and it's particularly lightweight for a headphone that is in this, super audiophile, ultra expensive $5,000 class. Usually they're pretty heavy, 325 grams, very light. Part of that lightweight can be attributed to the magnesium that went into the build and went into the frame. Magnesium was used both because it's a lightweight material and also because it's a very dampening material. So the housing also serves a function of dampening resonances and vibrations, which just makes it a more accurate sound. Then for the ear pads, there are 2 sets of ear pads included. The default ear pads are leather and then also sheepskin. The sheepskin kind of lines the inner ridge so that, it's nice and soft for the outside of your ear. These have more of like an analytical nature, I guess. And then more for like comfort and dampening effects are the ultra suede pads that come with it. I enjoyed listening with both, but my preferences, I think, swung more towards these leather and sheepskin pads. Both of the pads have a pretty similar consistency and density to them. They're both pretty soft and squishy. There's a lot of give when they're on your head, not very firm at all. They're both also pretty porous. And also just overall, I would say that the 5000 SE is a nice air rating sort of headphone. I don't think that sweat's going to be an issue because it is very, very open back. And then on top of that, the pads that come with it also have this nice airy sort of quality. So something more on the pads is that your ear is almost definitely not at risk of, bumping up against the driver. I hope you can see it from there that the driver is situated very far back in the headphone. But then there's this really lightweight, very forgiving sort of mesh material that's on the pads, and that will almost certainly be on top of your ear. To be honest, that didn't take any getting used to for me. It's actually a very, very non-intrusive sort of feeling. And it didn't give me any problems. But in case there are any people who are more sensitive to that than I am, just letting you know on that. Although I really don't think that very many people are going to mind it. Another thing about the pads, I know I'm talking a bit about the pads, but they do have a lot going for them, is they are very, very easy to swap out. You don't have to go through the sort of annoying process of, slipping a ridge along the edge of the headphone, and then, you have to use something to properly, wedge it on and get it in place. Yeah, you saw. I just did it. Clicks right into place. They're on these like plastic tracks on the headphone, and that makes things very, very easy. And then in the same vein of just, simple and convenient setup, I find that the cables insert into the headphone extremely easily. And I feel like once they're in, they're pretty firm. You're not really at risk of them like falling out unless you really tug them out somehow. And if you are doing that, you should be treating your $5,000 headphone better. So in terms of comfort, I really do give it top marks. It's really lightweight, has the secure but light headband pressure, porous pads, also really easy to change the pads. The only thing that really worried me when I first got my hands on the 5000 SE was this manual adjustment suspension headband. Usually I find these really obnoxious. There are a whole host of headphones, and you probably know the ones I'm talking about that have these, and I'm usually not a fan of their fit, but this I think is the most well-done way that I've seen it. There is a lot of resistance. You can even see like I really have to pull at it. And that really heavy resistance in the adjustment slider just helps it stay in place once you have it set up. And I can even show you now that doing it while it's on your head is pretty simple. There it is. It's going to stay like that for hours. Once that band is in place, it doesn't move. Now, just to quickly go over look, because you can see it for yourself. You can form your own opinions on that. But I am a very, very big fan of this sort of look. I like the idea of spending a lot of money on a headphone that doesn't look like a luxury product. It looks like a very like high-tech sort of product. And I get, very techie vibes from this sort of design, very professional and techie, and, kind of has like a studio vibe going for it. I also just really like these like yellow details on it. I think it is this sort of like semi like ugly feature that makes it look cool, if that makes sense. So yeah, kind of no frills, but also very like high-tech sort of look. And that is probably my preferred look for a headphone. Now we can get to the good part, which is what it sounds like. But I have to admit, this is kind of the hardest part of the review for me. And it's almost a difficult review to do because I don't know if you've experienced this, but when you just come across a headphone that leaves a kind of like perfect impression on you, it's hard to describe what it sounds like. Because, usually in reviews, I'll find a weakness or a certain emphasis or, something that's standing out a little wonky and kind of talk around that. And it was basically impossible for me to find really anything that I can warn you about with the YH-5000SE. Just to give, a brief overview, it's like it has a low end that I think will satisfy people who like a lot of bass. It also has a low end that is not going to turn people away and say it sounds too boomy. It has a very well-balanced and crisp sort of mid-range. And then it has boosted highs that come across like fairly loudly, but also very, very elegantly, very smooth. And to my ears, never came off as like risky, as like being painful or anything like that. But first, before we get into the balance, I'll go over Soundstage. And it might surprise you to hear me say that it doesn't have the biggest soundstage. At least it didn't present that way to me. What it did have going for it was more in the vein of imaging and fluidity and accuracy. I think my favorite part about the soundstage and imaging capabilities was just how accurate it was. And that, smaller stage, but also the really, really accurate imaging kind of gave me the impression of, looking at parts under a microscope in the spatial sense. And then that was also very, very well complemented by its balance, which I thought had excellent separation. I think that if there's something that I had to stake why I loved this headphone so much, I would say it's the separation, and I know it's a generalized word, but you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say clarity. Separation and clarity is really the name of the game with the 5000 SE. And then more on the stage, I would say it had more of a forward-facing sort of image with moments where it could travel over your shoulder. Honestly, kind of reminded me of the 109 Pro stage. I don't know if that's a total faux pas for me to say because they're completely different headphones, but similar sort of vibe where small stage, but very, very fluid and has like that over-the-shoulder capability. Now, when it comes to the low end, might not surprise you to hear me say this, but this is my kind of low end. I haven't seen the frequency response graph for this, so I can't really speak on that level, but at least the way it presented to my ears, on a subjective basis, I found that the most prominent sort of part of the low end was really contained to the subs and the deeper end of the mid bass. And it kept high bass sounding mostly natural and maybe even a little attenuated, which I'm all for that. The YH-5000, I would say, is emphasizing something between 20 hertz to 80 or 100 hertz. That emphasis is really, really deep. So deep, in fact, that I would say that you're feeling that emphasis a little more than you're hearing that emphasis, which I think is a really good thing. It's bass balances like that allow the rest of the mix to be heard, even with the really exciting energy going on in the low end. And then aside, I think, from just having a smartly tuned low end, it's a very, very sensitive and detailed low end. I was listening to the track Prospect Hummer by Animal Collective. Towards the end of the second verse of that song, all the instruments and vocals fade out. And when I was listening to it with the 5000 SE, I realized that all during the second verse, there was like some sort of timpani or floor tom that was being really, really lightly tapped, but tapped just enough so that there was a really quiet, like low end resonance, kind of like sub bass resonance that was going on. And once all of the vocals and the instruments faded out, that resonance, continued for a little longer. And then I heard that, fade out as well. And that's a song that I have listened to. This is no exaggeration, probably hundreds of times. It is, in fact, a headphone test song for me. I've listened to it on other very, very high-end headphones, but honestly, the 5000 SE is the only one that revealed like a really small detail like that to me. Aside from the tuning, this low-end clarity is also achieved from a really, really fast driver. You definitely hear that speed all throughout the frequency spectrum, but I think it's demonstrated really well in the lows, specifically because of the bass slam that the SE is able to produce. I think there is a very healthy amount of both slam and rumble going on, but not so much that it's obfuscating anything or throwing anything off or making anything sound really dark. Even though there are these very dominant sub and mid bass frequencies, at the end of the day, it is definitely not a darker headphone. And in fact, there are elements of brightness to it, and some of those elements begin in the mids. So like I was saying, to my ears, it sounded like the high bass, and also, the way I think about it is high bass and low mids are usually kind of connected, representing similar things. So I would say that low mids, high bass, a little attenuated, maybe, just at a natural level. They don't really jump out in any way. What jumped out to me more was high mids, and I heard that in vocals, and I heard that in synth parts and guitar parts. It was more of like the aggressive and driving overtones in those parts rather than the softer fundamentals. I guess when I say softer, I just mean, kind of lower pitched fundamentals that kind of impart a softness when they're boosted. It wasn't that. I would say that the high mids gave it a little bit of edge, a little bit of drive. It made snare drums crack, maybe a little more than they thumped. And just overall, I feel like I'm kind of trying to paint a picture here where there is a lot of space given between the boosts. You have boosted mid bass and sub bass, and then takes it easy for the high bass, for the low mids, the center mids, and then, waits until the high mids to start, I guess, like adding a little more color back in, but keeps things very moderate between mid bass to high mids before, it starts making changes again. Even though it's more of a high mids balance, I would still say that overall the mids present very naturally. Like, there's nothing about vocals or anything like that sounds like one quality is really being overemphasized over the others. What I'm talking about with the additional drive that I heard in parts, that was really something that I had to listen for, that kind of popped out to me more with extensive listens, but it's not going to be one of the first qualities that you notice with the 5000 SE. And then high end is maybe the hardest part for me to describe because to my ears, it is simply perfect. The 5000 SE puts a pretty heavy emphasis on its treble, but does it in a really, really smooth and controlled way, where other headphones are risking pain by, putting boosts in their treble. The 5000 SE is really doing nothing but adding detail and also adding air, because there's a really, really nice treble extension as well. There is definitely a certain harmonic emphasis going on. So for example, I was listening to the song Peloton by Dan Deacon, which is off of a soundtrack that he did. And that song has very ringing sort of harmonic qualities that are going on separately. And each year it's a very sort of binaural song. And one trait about the high end that I thought was really impressive and just a testament to whatever is going on inside of these drivers was I still felt the vibrations even in the really, really high frequencies. I was still feeling the ridges of my ear vibrate a bit. I was still feeling the air movements of the higher frequencies, even as much lower frequencies, were rumbling along with them. And then, like I noted, there is a fair deal of extension with it, but it is, I think, just enough to be giving a lot of air and a lot of detail, where if you're listening to string performances, you're going to hear movements on the neck string. If you're listening to reed instruments, you're going to hear some of that, spitty reed sound. And with vocals, you're going to hear all those little tiny mouth clicks and little details like that. So in the same way that the low end, I feel is super sensitive to just the tiniest little movements and, idiosyncrasies that went on in the recording, the high end is similarly as sensitive, if not more sensitive to that regard. It just occurred to me that maybe you're thinking that I'm describing a U-shaped frequency response, but it's not that. The points of emphasis in its tuning aren't dramatic enough, I think, to qualify this as a U-shaped sound at all. And vocals still come through with a lot of natural clarity. I didn't find them attenuated in any way, which is usually an indication that what you're listening to is not a U-shaped balance. Now, the 5000 SE is 34 ohms, so if you wanted to be a degenerate, you could run it out of, your computer's headphone port or your little phone dongle. I mean, that is pretty sacrilegious, though. And I will say that I was listening to it with my little Sony Walkman DAC here. And I think that using a really high quality source for it went a very long way. Kind of works both ways. If you end up with the 5000 SE, you should definitely get a really high quality DAC just because I think it's going to bring the most out of the headphones. That goes for any headphone, but really, really goes for these. And then also vice versa. If you already have a really high quality source, I think you are going to hear the most of that quality with the 5000 SE. All in all, one of the most detailed and sensitive headphones that I've listened to in a long time. Has, I think, a really smart, colorful tuning that isn't intrusive to the mix. The colorations that it did made, I thought were really welcome and honestly really beautiful. And what impressed me more than anything was just the degree of separation that it was capable of carrying out. When I was listening to really, really busy tracks, within those really busy mixes, I was able to, pick out each individual layer. And then also when I was listening to really minimalistic tracks, it kind of exposes all of the idiosyncrasies, even little mistakes that went on in the recording. So works both ways. And I think that, again, that's in part because it has a very, very fast sort of driver, really great detail retrieval, really great resolve. When it comes to value, a lot of the times when I am reviewing a headphone that's $4,000, $5,000, whatever it is, it's kind of hard to say if it is truly representing that value. It's kind of hard to say, well, actually this should be a $6,000 headphone instead of a $5,000 headphone or whatever it is. And on top of that, a lot of the times I'm kind of thinking in the back of my mind, about diminishing returns in the headphone game and all of that. That is not at all what I was thinking about by the time I was done reviewing the 5000 SE. This, I would say, more than any headphone that I've tried before, is regretfully worthy of its price tag. I mean, I hate to say that. I would love to say that it is worthy of 1/10 of its price tag, because then I could actually go home with this. But to my ears, and in my opinion, this is probably the highest end sounding headphone that I've ever heard. And I don't say that lightly. You can hold me to that in future videos. I am sticking with that until something else comes along and dethrones it. This is definitely a current favorite of mine, 100% worthy of the gold award that I gave it in my review. If you're considering getting the Yamaha YH-5000SE, you can help support the channel by buying it through the link that I am putting in the video description down below to the Audio 46 store. So if you want to just see more videos and reviews like this, remember to like and subscribe. So this is Chris with Major Hi-Fi, and anyway, I'll see you next time, and I'll see you at CanJam.